Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Transmissions. Inside of an automatic transmission, it's kind of this voodoo magic power coming in one end and out the other end. You get all sorts of fun. They're really not all that complicated. There's a few things to understand them, and there's a few things that are important to, make sure you check when you disassemble one. And in this video series, this is part one, but it should show you how to break down and completely disassemble your TH350 or Turbo 350 transmission. So let's get it going. The Turbo 350 transmission. Now guys, this is an iconic transmission, and this particular one happens to be for a four-wheel drive vehicle because there is no tail housing on the back and the output shaft is relatively short, allowing you to bolt on a transfer case. Most things in this video are still going to apply even if you did have a two-wheel drive transmission. There really isn't much difference, and the differences there are, I'm going to talk about them, so have no fear. You found the right video. We're going to take this thing completely apart. I'm going to show you what to check. I'm going to show you what to replace. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks along the way, and also kind of explain to you how it works so you can understand that voodoo magic. Now, one of the very first things about this Turbo 350 transmission is I know it's for a Chevy motor. This transmission came in both Chevys and Pontiacs, and there is a difference in the bell housing. This is a Chevy bell housing because at the top, it's got this peak in it. And if it was a Pontiac bell housing, it would actually have a valley up here on top. So depending upon what motor you're bolting your Turbo 350 up to, you're gonna wanna make sure you got the right one. There's a lot of these for sale for really cheap out there. A lot of people often don't even know what they came off of. That's a quick, easy way to know. But there is something else that's pretty cool about these. It's very rare, but every once in a while, you'll come across a Turbo 350 with a bell housing that has both bolt patterns in it. If you come around to the front here and you see double bolt patterns, then that's what that's for. And you can basically bolt it up to either engine. Kind of cool. Well, we're gonna get started on this 3-speed Turbo 350 right now.
Yes! That's awesome.
Step number one, if you still have a dipstick tube on your transmission, you're gonna wanna remove that, just make it easier to work on. Now this one's already pretty loose, but I'm basically just gonna grab it, kind of turn it, give it a pull, it's gonna come right out. This one gets sealed with a boot or an O-ring, depending upon the year of your transmission, but they come out pretty simple. You're gonna stick that off to the side. Next, we're gonna remove the kickdown cable. Now, a kickdown cable is hooked up to your throttle linkage. That basically allows your vehicle to downshift into a passing gear. Without that kickdown cable hooked up to your throttle linkage, if you were to step on the gas, this thing would just pretty much stay in whatever gear it was in. A prior owner either cut this kickdown cable or it broke, but we're basically gonna remove it. That's done down here with a 10mm bolt, and you kind of just take it off. Now, hopefully you can see in here, basically this has a loop at the end of your kickdown cable, and that basically just comes off this little arm that goes inside the trans. I'll explain more what that looks like once we get in there, but you're just gonna wanna kind of lift that off. I do have a new kickdown cable for this. I'll show you guys when we reinstall it, but this is garbage. Now this is some of that voodoo magic. The intermediate accumulator right here on the transmission is basically gonna be what controls your first gear to second gear shift. If you look on the back side of it, there's gonna be a little hole back there that you can stick a pick through, something like this, and there's a snap ring in there. You're basically gonna stick that pick through, loosen up that snap ring, remove it, the whole thing just kind of starts coming apart. Again, you're gonna wanna stay organized, put all these snap rings and everything off to the side because you do not want to lose them. All right, at this point, This cover should pop out of here fairly easily. Sometimes they fight you a little bit. It's maybe sometimes by using a pick and getting in there, kind of prying on it a little bit here and there. You should be able to get that cover out of there. But like I said, they fight you every once in a while. So you just gotta mess with it until you can get them to kind of pop themselves out. There we go. And we found some more trans fluid. Come on, girl, get out of there. There we go. You gotta be careful. There's usually a rubber O-ring on this cover. And in our case, that rubber O-ring kind of stayed in there and it's really hard and really nasty brittle. So that right there is a sign to me that this transmission has not been opened for a really long time. Now, not overly shocking because this particular one came out of a 70s Chevy, K5 square body truck. So it probably means it hasn't been opened. Another thing that you can take a look at is this spring in here, okay? When you pull this spring out, a lot of times these are broken. That spring's not broken. So although this had been in there a long time and that O-ring might be dried out, this is a really good sign that this trans probably isn't too beat up. We'll have to get inside and check out more, but that's a really good sign. Now this spring may not be there at all. A lot of times the old school guys would have actually removed that spring completely when they reassembled it, and it would have given it a really, really, really firm, neck breaking 1 to 2 upshift. So
Took the restrictor plate off, give the Red Dragon a little more juice. But let's keep that on the down low.
But after you remove that spring, you're gonna wanna get in there and remove your accumulator. Essentially, you can grab this, that's your accumulator right there with those O-rings in it. And that, like I said, controls that 1-2 upshift. All right, next we're gonna move straight back after that and we come back here to our modulator. Now this helps control shifts as well. This one is an older style. It's got a nipple on it for a vacuum line. Some newer styles might have like a threaded bolt in there that you would adjust. But anyway, this just basically has a hold down plate, so you're gonna remove that. I think I said a 10 millimeter earlier on that kickdown cable. It was actually a 7/16. Because this one is older, it actually has standard sockets basically holding the entire thing together. If it was a newer one, it would be metric. So that's another way to know whether this transmission originally came out of the vehicle you were told or not. All right, got that hold down bracket off of there. Take this guy out of here. I don't like throwing out parts until I have the new parts in my hand and I've confirmed that they fit. So we definitely are not going to be reusing this, but it's always good to have for comparison purposes should a kit send you the wrong one. So I'm going to hold on to it for now, but again, not reusing it. And a quick tip to help you guys keep all your bolts organized and straight. Things like this that go back into the housing, make sure you take the bolt, you put it back where you found it. That way you keep them organized and where they belong. After you've removed your modulator, you actually have a modulator valve inside. So you're gonna reach down in there with a pair of pliers. All right, so guys, real quick thing about this modulator valve. You guys saw me pull it out with that pair of pliers very easily. I did not have to fight it. That wasn't some YouTube camera trick. That was actually the way this was installed. And that's a really good sign in this transmission that this thing wasn't beat to all heck, or that maybe it had been gone through obviously many years ago and then maybe not many miles were put on, right? Because those O-rings are trashed. But this modulator, if it's stuck, okay, that's going to allow this transmission, or prevent, I should say, this transmission when you come to a stop out on the street from downshifting into first gear. So if you have one of these transmissions, it's only a 3-speed, you come to a stop at a stop sign, traffic light, whatever, and you start to accelerate and it's stuck in second gear, usually this modulator valve is stuck in there and doesn't want to move freely. So that's a telltale sign. The fact that this one was nice and free and slipped out of there with no effort is a really good sign. Let's get back to it. All right, now you guys have probably noticed that this transmission here is not in the absolute cleanest condition, right? There's some dirt and grime around. After this case is completely stripped and I don't have anything on it blocking my ability to get in there and clean it really well, I'm gonna do that so that I can put a nice fresh coat of paint on it later. Try to get as much dirt and grime and grease off of it as you can when you're doing this. It'll just make the job easier, but we're gonna move around to this side and get after the governor. This cap is basically held in here with this spring retainer clip. Now, don't be alarmed if that spring retainer clip is not on your transmission. Some transmissions never come with them. They should be there, but if they're not, you'll see in a second that that cover for that governor is actually, you know, pressed in there. It can sometimes fight you coming out. So it's not going to fall out if that spring clip isn't there, but if you have it, you should definitely reuse it. We're going to get that off just by giving it a little pry job here with the screwdriver. That's what that clip looks like. We'll stick it off to the side with everything else. Now, when it comes time to prying this off, you're gonna wanna get after it with a screwdriver, but you definitely wanna hit it on an angle because there is an O-ring in there, and you'd prefer to not, you know, damage it so we can inspect it, but that's what we're gonna do. Get in here with a hammer, knock it off. If you look down in there, there is an O-ring, and you can see this O-ring is supposed to be round, and it's just completely square. So just like all the other O-rings, will have to be replaced. Remember to keep this cap off to the side. You'll need it for the rebuild. This little beauty here is the governor, and this should slide in and out of your transmission pretty easily. This governor is going to have to be replaced for a couple of reasons. Number one, this gear on the top is obviously hogged out. It should not look like that. It should basically be a rectangle shape. So the fact that it's worn out in here, not good. This gear basically turns the governor and creates hydraulic fluid or hydraulic pressure. When it basically moves these, a valve in the middle here should be going up and down, and it doesn't move at all. So that's gonna have to be replaced. Now, normally after you remove the governor would be time to go directly behind the governor where I don't have anything and remove your speedometer gear, and then basically your tail housing would come off and you would have an output shaft that is much longer. Because this was a four-wheel drive transmission, I don't have that speedometer gear or the tail housing, but taking that apart is very simple. If you have a two-wheel drive transmission, now would be the time to do that. Take that apart, inspect that speedometer gear, and obviously that speedometer gear comes in different ratios, and that would be how you would fine-tune your speedometer to your tire size and your gear ratios in your rear end. Our linkage here basically, right, determines what gear we're in this transmission, and at this point we're going to remove it simply by removing that nut. I'd be willing to bet that this is loose already. Oh yeah, look at that. All right guys, now it's time to spin our transmission around again and start to attack the pump on the front. These are usually 1/2-inch bolts in here. And you can see there's a seal. Your torque converter would usually slide on. We've obviously already removed that. At this point, we're just gonna remove all these bolts. I'm gonna do that with an impact just to make quick work of it, and we'll keep going. You'll notice that they have washers on them. You can't mistake them really for anything else inside this transmission, but you're definitely not gonna wanna lose them. So keep them off to the side, and we're ready to spin around and pull the pan off. You're gonna want some paper towels handy. Hopefully this is enough. I already drained this transmission pan a few days ago in preparation for this. I let it drip dry overnight, in fact, but you saw how much fluid still came out of this thing when I removed that accumulator. Well, now after we have made all these holes basically in the sides of this trans by removing all that stuff, it's time to flip it over and remove the pan and probably get pretty messy. Usually right now is where you see all the fluid just start running out of this trans. And sweet baby Jesus, there it comes. That's actually not too bad. That's actually not too bad. My wife says that I'm messy. I don't know where she gets that from, but let me tell you, that is the least of my concerns right now. Anyway, let's get the pan off and start taking apart the rest of this thing. Get to the guts, get to the good stuff. Here's a quick way to also tell from the bottom of a transmission if you have a turbo 350 or a turbo 400. Your turbo 400 is going to have a completely square pan. It's not going to have this angled cut here right on the passenger side rear corner. So on that right rear corner, if yours has that angled cut, you're going to know it's a turbo 350. Oh yeah, look at the inside of that guy. That's probably not a good sign. I'll tell you right now, one of the things that tells me that this transmission has been opened up and at least serviced once before in its life is this filter. Now, this filter is a newer style filter. Sometimes you'll see these with like a 10mm bolt or something in there. Obviously, sometimes you'll see them with a flathead screwdriver bolts in there, but when you take these off, this filter is going to come off, and that's a newer style. The earlier ones usually had like a felt filter in there that you could clean. That's not this, so that's kind of cool. That's kind of a good sign, but clearly with that governor before and other things, we're going to have to replace it. But next step is basically going to be to remove this filter. 2 flathead screws. I don't think you need to see me do that, so typical YouTube fashion. The next step on this trans is going to be to remove the linkage right here for the kickdown cable. Do not lose this little pin here. This was the thing that kickdown cable hooked onto, and you don't want to lose any of this linkage stuff. This can all be cleaned up and reused, especially this little clip. Just kind of pry the whole clip off. Kind of put that back together, stick it off to the side. Now that we've removed that piece of linkage off there, you get a better view of that valve right there. So if you remember how that linkage was installed with that pin, basically that pin, this linkage here basically was pivoting when this cable was pulled. So when you set it up on your gas pedal and it pulls the cable when like you step on the gas real hard, it actually activates that valve and forces a downshift, right? And then it obviously won't upshift until it builds up enough pressure. But that's what that is. We're going to leave that bolt in there to leave that valve in there. No reason to take it apart. But at this point, I put the screws back in there, or the bolts back in there for the filter. And now we're going to remove all of these bolts all over this thing. They're 1/2 inch. That's how we remove the valve body. At this point, right, we're going to pull out our manual valve. Do not lose this S clip here. Remember I showed you the accumulator on the other side, which controlled the first gear to second gear shift. Well, this is the second gear to third gear accumulator. At this point, we're going to take these bolts out here, remove this hold down plate, but be careful. There are 4, sometimes 5, but 4 check balls in here that you do not want to fall out. So be very careful when you're taking this off that they don't go anywhere. Again, 1/2 inch, this plate. Now you see some water kind of coming out of here. It's because I was able to actually clean up this transmission outside. I kind of mentioned that earlier. But this is the other side of that accumulator, right? There's that spring that was in there. There's another seal on top of this. It's flat. Again, not to be shocked because of everything else we've seen. That valve body removed, you're going to want to get in there with a single edge scraper and clean whatever gasket material is left. I'm going to rebuild that valve body with something called a shift kit from Transgo, and I'm going to do that in another video. So that valve body will essentially be ready to just be bolted back in. Look for that video on the page if you're interested in installing a shift kit. But at this point, I'm basically just going to finish cleaning things up and we're going to move on. However, before I can spray out this side of the transmission and really get all the little remnants of the gasket material like this out of there, I need to find my check balls. Now, there are 4 check balls in this transmission, and we can see that there's one here. Toward the front, there's one down here. There's one down here, and then there's one here. I'm gonna take a picture of that with my cell phone just so I have a reference point to put it back together. Again, my shift kit from Transgo is gonna tell me exactly where to put them, but it doesn't hurt to ever have one of those reference points, and a photograph is a great way of doing that. If your transmission had an extra check ball, like a 5th check ball up here toward the front, that would be a lockup transmission. Obviously, a lockup transmission is going to need a different torque converter, but this transmission is a non-lockup. That's perfect. Now that I've confirmed it, I can order a new torque converter matched to the cam in my engine so that everything will perform correctly. All right, the next thing you're going to want to remove out of here, guys, is the filter. Okay, there's a secondary little filter in here This guy's important. Number one, you don't want to lose it. Number two, it's really only in there as a safety measure. We can clean it out. There's a little bit of gunk in there, nothing too crazy. But this basically saves the pump gears if there's any metal contamination inside of your transmission. At this point, you're going to want to break the pump loose, and the easiest way to do that is to kind of get your screwdriver in there a little bit, and then you're basically just going to kind of pull it forward while you're pulling on the pump. That whole pump there is just going to kind of break itself loose. So you can see there how it just basically knocked the pump loose, makes it a little bit easier to get it out.
Mother of God.
So this is our pump. This up here, these rings are an indication that it was already worked on because they're a newer style here. They're steel. But anyway, we got 5 bolts around. They're 1/2 inch usually. We're gonna spin those off and start taking our pump apart. This is the pressure plate. The springs sometimes will be attached to this pressure plate. This is a different style, so just be careful that you don't lose any of these springs or any of the bolts. We're gonna pull all these springs out and just give them a quick little inspection, make sure none of these springs are broken. This is the piston, okay? This is what is responsible for basically engaging the intermediate clutches. And I'll tell you, these gaskets in here, these lip rings in here aren't so bad, so that's a good sign.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
We also have a pump washer. Sometimes your washer will have a shim underneath it. End play on these Turbo 350s is real important. We'll talk about that when we rebuild the transmission in another video. Now we're gonna flip the pump over. Take a look at it here. We got a little bit of gunk in there. Everything on this pump looks pretty good. Just to give it a quick once over. I mean, obviously we're gonna have to clean it. Definitely have some gunk in there. So again, good thing we're taking it apart. These are the pump gears. As you can see, there's an indicator dot that's stamped into it right here by my finger. And then you have another one on the inner gear that's stamped here. The real important thing to remember, like I said a second ago, is with those stamped dots, because when you take this inner gear out, which we're gonna do, we want to inspect the outside edge of this outer gear. You'll notice that these little metal tabs in here are actually closer to one side than they are on the other. And if you try to flip it over and put it back in upside down the wrong way, it'll go in. And the problem then is that this tab is too close to the front of the pump. And then the problem is when you try to slide your torque converter on, when these are toward the front, you won't be able to get it all the way in. So you need to make sure that those dots are facing the right direction. You mark them so that there's no confusion about where these go. At this point, we're gonna pull the other gear out. It's kind of got some oil suction in there. Gonna take a look at this. Yeah, that pump gear looks pretty good there. Now it's time to remove our intermediate clutches, the drum and everything. Usually you'll have a pump gasket, basically all the way around here. Obviously you can tell that our pump gasket is not there. And that's because our pump gasket actually came out attached to the pump. It was pretty baked on there. I had to use that single edge scraper to get it off in a bunch of pieces, but that's off. Now we're gonna get this out. So at this point, we have our wavy in there. We'll talk about that later on the rebuild video. We're gonna pull off our steels. Then we have all of our intermediate clutches and stuff in here. And it's real important to basically keep all of this stuff in the right order as you take it out. Kind of makes putting it back together a little bit easier. Clutches in here. All right, so again, just intermediate clutches are wavy. Clutch material actually looks pretty good. Sometimes you'll see on these clutches that these grooves and stuff are not in them anymore, or at least in a particular place on the clutch. Right, and now we have our intermediate drum assembly, which we're going to take off and talk about. And this metal band you see me pointing at here is responsible for your 1 to 2 manual shift. They hardly ever wear out, but they are kind of stuck in there and will prevent this drum from being removed. So here's how you do it. It's basically anchored in place down here in the corner. So if you can get in there with your screwdriver and kind of pry that anchor off, as you pull on the input shaft, that whole thing should just come right out. With that removed, we have our band. Now, this band, I mean, they can be reused. I'm not gonna reuse it, we're gonna replace it. Obviously, there's some rust damage in there. There was some water inside this case. I'll show you more evidence of that in a little bit. We're just gonna now lift off our direct drum. All right, we're gonna go ahead here, remove our frictions from this drum. These are what we call direct frictions, right? This is third and reverse, and it's held in there with a little snap ring. So again, save that, keep it off to the side. With the drum removed, the next step would be to get the frictions and steels out. Sometimes it helps to kind of tip it over and dump them into your hand, but depending upon the condition of everything, they can kind of fight you a little bit. Obviously, you want to try to keep them in order, right? That's kind of the name of the game here, staying organized. These, obviously, you know, they look okay. Again, we have the little lines through them. I don't know if you can see it there on camera all that well, but sometimes you'll see these, you know, kind of worn smooth. Obviously, this one up here, I take that back. We're losing a little bit of material here. You can kind of see where it flaked off. So again, you know, time to rebuild it. Some water got in there. More evidence of that down in here as well. Steels look okay. These will get all discolored if it ran hot. But again, we're losing more material up there. So it's just time, you know. So with those frictions, right, those clutches removed out of this drum, we're on to the next step. Now, we're going to remove the sprag off the front of that drum. And I say front because it was facing the front of the transmission. Now, that's a wear item. That part kind of works like a cam inside this trans, and there's things in there to look for wear. So without further ado, let's get back to it. I'll show you how to take it apart, and I'll show you what to look for and inspect. Sometimes it's real obvious that it's bad. It doesn't matter if your transmission's been rebuilt before, because a lot of the times people don't replace those and they'll just kind of spruce up the, you know, the clutches and stuff. So let's get back to it, keep tearing it apart. So we have our drum here. Now you'll notice we're facing it toward the front of the transmission, right? This is kind of the way it's sat on top of that drum over there. And this turns and rotates counterclockwise, but clockwise it will not turn. So at this point, there's a little snap ring in here. I'm gonna remove that, pull the cover off, and you'll see what I'm talking about. You know, again, keep that off to the side. Remove our cover. You're basically just gonna turn this, right? You'll notice it doesn't go the other way, but when we turn this, we're gonna turn it and kind of pull a little bit. And as we turn it counterclockwise and pull, this gear will just come off. And this, guys, on here is our sprag. Now, the sprag is just gonna lift straight off, but you can see there's these little rollers all over it. And sometimes these will wear so much that when you remove this, the rollers will actually fall out. It should come off fairly easily. Sometimes you gotta work it back and forth like this. But let's see if the rollers fall. Okay, that's a good sign. All right, so hopefully you guys can see here all these little rollers. Now, these rollers don't have a pin through them or anything, so they're basically just held in place with these springs. And these springs sometimes will lose a little bit of tension, and the little space right down deep in here, I'm not sure if you can really see it. These rollers will kind of slide back and forth as they need to. And usually you might see a little bit of wear in there, but I'm actually not really seeing any. So this may have been replaced once before. Or like we've been saying all along, this transmission just didn't have that many miles on it, but a lot of age. Did notice that there's a little bit of rust down inside this. Obviously we have some discoloration and some light surface rust on this drum. We have the same thing over here on this drum. So I could probably get that cleaned up. I'm going to attempt to get that cleaned up so I don't have to replace these parts, but that's just one of the things to deal with a used transmission. Now that we know that this sprag is actually in good shape, we're going to wind up reinstalling it. So you're just going to kind of find where everything was. Kind of put it back on. Now you can see here the alignment, right? How the sprag, how the gear here is kind of cut, and then the sprag is cut to match it. I kind of had it flipped around. So gonna take our gear here that looks like it's in good shape. There's nothing wrong with it. No rust, no contaminants in there. So just kind of nice and gently get that guy back on there. Again, counterclockwise to drop it back on because it locks going the other way. Now we're going to drop our cover back on. Something to notice about the cover here right by my finger is there's a little nub on that side and one on the other side. They're going to line up with spots on the drum so that it drops down on there. Now we're just going to put our snap ring back in place. Now onto this guy. We have a bearing on the top, little thrust bearing. I'm going to take that off, put it off to the side. And inside of here, we have more forward clutches held in with another snap ring. Once again, just give them a quick little inspection here. Put my snap ring over there and stick this guy off to the side. Now we're just gonna reach down inside of here and grab our forward planetary, pull that out. That basically is gonna have a 3-tab washer. Just taking a quick look here. So you don't have to necessarily inspect everything to the point where I am. I'm doing it on this because obviously I know that this transmission was introduced to water. So I'm looking to make sure that places like this inside where I can't get that rust off that easily. Because again, everything is coated in trans fluid. So that rust, it's not deep, it's not pitted, it's not terrible. I'll be able to get it off or at least clean it up to the point where I can continue to build with most of these parts. You do have to be careful. Sometimes when you pull this off, there's like a washer in here that'll be stuck to this. Ours actually is still in here, so that's not a bad thing, but we have that with our 3-tab washer. Gonna stick that off to the side. This is that washer that I was just talking to you guys about. It's got tabs in it so that it basically goes into the holes here on the Planetary. Everything in there moves nicely. So deep down inside this transmission, there is a snap ring that holds the Planetary on. Now, a snap ring is a little bit different than a circle clip. A snap ring doesn't actually have little holes drilled in the end of it. So circle clip pliers don't work to remove that. You saw me with the other ones actually use a pick and a screwdriver, and I was able to kind of pry them off, no big deal. Well, they do make a special pair of snap ring pliers. The problem with those is you have to basically get all the way in there underneath this lip at the top onto a snap ring that's essentially the same outside diameter as that shaft. So I basically ran out to a local auto parts store, picked up a pair of snap ring pliers, modified them myself with a Dremel. Now I'm going to be able to get in there with a pick and these and pop that off. And there we go, guys. Now with a little wiggle, you remove that Planetary. Now you just want to basically spin the gears around on the Planetary, make sure they're nice and smooth, make sure nothing's all hogged out, and that it doesn't have to be replaced. Now we're gonna reach in there, basically pull out our shell. This is very obviously the side of the trans that was buried in some water here. That was my main concern with this thing, but to be honest with you, a lot of this stuff's just gonna come right off. I don't think I'm gonna have to replace that. I think I'll be able to clean it up and get it to work, but we'll stick that off to the side. Real quick tip here is to actually take your screwdriver and kind of carve a little pick in, or a little notch in the end of it here. Makes it real easy to kind of reach on in there and remove that snap ring. All right, we're gonna reach in there and we have another one of these little 4-prong plastic washers. Now it's time to remove our center support. Now that can be a little bit tricky because sometimes the cases of these transmissions get a little bit worn out over time, making it a little bit more difficult to remove it. So if yours doesn't pop right out, which they hardly ever do.
That's what she said.
Here's how you're gonna do that. You're gonna take a long straight blade screwdriver. Down inside this transmission, there's a gap. If you'll notice, we have basically almost the same gap around all these teeth all the way around, but there's a big gap over here. Now, normally there's a spring pressing up against this tooth on this side, and it kind of forces it over time to wear into the case a tiny bit, preventing you from being able to just lift and pull this out. So by pushing on that edge of that spring, and I'll show you exactly what I mean in a second, but by pushing on that spring, you can actually get the pressure to release off of the rest of this and then lift it right out. You'll also notice that I'm now sitting and the transmission is basically sitting on the floor. That also makes it easy because then you're not fighting gravity wanting to, drop this toward the bottom of the case when it's on your workbench. Stand it up on its tail housing that you've already removed, and basically makes it a lot easier to kind of have the whole thing just center itself and lift it right out. With this pulled out, this is that spring that I was talking to you guys about a minute ago. You can kind of see it there. And the way it's held in that wide spot, this is the edge that you're gonna see, right? One side's flat, the other side kind of sticks up in the opposite direction. You get a screwdriver on that and kind of collapse this spring a little bit, and it'll help this come right out. This is called the anti-clunk spring. Now, all the way back down in there, because we had this case laying on its tail shaft, and you're gonna have a bearing. This bearing was basically sitting on the back side, right? But because of how we pulled it off, obviously it was stuck in there. This is our output shaft. These teeth right here are what engage your transmission when you put it in park. This is in good shape. Nothing about it is super rusty or nasty. Got a tiny spot here like I did on other things, but you see me putting my finger on it, right, it kind of goes away. So nothing I won't be able to clean up later. The front side of this usually will also have a bearing, but sometimes it'll actually have a washer here like this, little metal washer with 3 legs. And then you'll see the 3 holes in here that those 3 little legs will fit into. It just kind of depends on your particular model. We're gonna stick that off to the side. We'll actually stick it back on there. We're gonna remove the rear Planetary. Inside looks pretty good. That was my main concern. Same thing back here, right? You just wanna spin all these around, check them. Low reverse frictions in the back. There's 5 of them. And here we have the roller clutch. Same thing as the sprag earlier where it will spin counterclockwise. And as you do that, you can kind of pull it toward you a little bit and it'll wind up coming out. That one's in good shape there. Looks pretty good. You can pick it up. You got all those roller balls still in there like we did earlier on that other sprag. None of them are falling out. That's a good thing. So now we're just gonna remove the snap ring, take it out and inspect it. Same thing, just kind of work it out nice and slowly. Take a look. This one actually looks pretty good. Being that it's good, I'm gonna gently slide this thing back on there. Put our snap ring back in there. Same thing, right? Counterclockwise to kind of guide it back in. Locks clockwise, spins freely counterclockwise. That's kind of what you're looking for there. We are almost done here. There is not much left at this point. But the last thing that is left is probably going to be easier to see with the, again, the tail housing down on the floor and the camera and the light pointing down in there. So let's get to it. Way down in there, I can see the end of my snap ring. And the only way that we're gonna get that snap ring to come out is to use a clutch spring compressor tool. Now, I bought this one on Amazon. They don't have to be expensive when you're not doing this day in and day out, but you need to position this tool so that you can get your pliers down in there at the end of that snap ring. Otherwise, you're gonna compress it, free it up, and not be able to remove it. And I'm sorry guys, the GoPro battery died. You didn't get to see me remove it, but at this point, you know what it looks like. There's the snap ring. All right, got the trans back up on the bench. Gonna remove our spring compressor tool. Just like earlier, right? Sometimes these have springs attached to them. Sometimes the springs stay in there. So once again, we're gonna pull all those springs out, keep them with this and with this snap ring. That way we don't lose anything. But like I said, you're gonna pull them out. You'll see little studs in there that those springs sit on. Just make sure none of them are broken as you take them out. We'll clean them up, we'll get them all back in there. All right guys, there is one final thing we need to remove on this transmission. Before you step back, scratch your head, freak out, think about what you've done and how now you don't have a transmission, you need to put it back together. I'm just kidding, guys. It's really not that hard. No need to panic. But do you remember on that output shaft a couple minutes ago, I talked about those teeth that were where your parking tooth engages? Well, that piston way in the back, now that we removed that clutch spring, is not going to want to come out because of that tooth. That is the tooth that engages. So ignore the mess that we made. We're gonna fix it up all nicey nice, but we basically have to get that guy to release itself so that we can get this guy, this big piston right here, this whole thing to come falling out. And the way you do that is by backing out the bolt entirely toward the rear of the transmission that connects your shifter linkage, and then back out the bolt just in front of it, just a little bit. You don't have to back it out all the way. That will allow that tooth to kind of fall out of the way. You'll flip the transmission over, stand it up on its bell housing, and use an air compressor to blow out that piston. Just gonna stand it up, gonna take your air gun, blow some air, it's gonna blow that piston right out of there. Just so you guys see exactly which hole I just used, because there are two. There's one here, and then there's one to the outside that kind of blows up in there. It follows this cast tube right here up in, and then you can see the rest of that cast tube right there, and it kind of gets the air behind that piston, blows it right out. Holy moly, you just took apart your first Turbo 350 transmission. You have a crap ton of parts now to replace, inspect, clean. We're gonna take care of all of that. And like I said earlier in this video, I'm gonna show you guys how to install a shift kit in your valve body to beef up this transmission and have it shift really nice off-road or even on-road. And we'll make another video showing you guys how to put it back together. When you clean it, I would keep that air compressor charged up, because now you're gonna wanna get into your valve body, blow all the junk out of there, really clean it. And now is the time, like I also said earlier in the video, to make sure that you guys get all the gunk and everything off the case so that you guys, when you're finished, can repaint it and make it look all nicey nice, like the rest of your rig and like the guts of your transmission is gonna be. Anyway, guys, thank you for the support. Share this with your friends. Be on the lookout for part 2, where we put this badass transmission back together. Anyway, guys, get out there and build something.